Today I want to talk about the 5 mistakes and what to avoid in buying commercial real estate in 2025. Ready? Let's go. Number 1, life and safety issues. When you are buying a property, you owe it to yourself to hire a professional inspector to look at that property and analyze it for you for safety and habitability issues. I recently sold a 17-unit apartment complex, and unbeknownst to us, tweakers had stripped the ground wire, and I was told that had someone touched that wire, it could have potentially electrocuted them. We didn't even know that until the building inspector, the commercial inspector, went through on behalf of the buyer and took a look at that. So let's talk about inspectors first. If you've bought a house, you probably have had a home inspection. That is very similar for commercial inspections. I call them building inspections, but they're really commercial property inspections. And the 5 areas that they typically look at are life and safety, electrical, plumbing, roof and attic, and then the foundation. So what I'd like to do is touch base on each of the 5 areas and kind of give you some tips and some suggestions of things to look for. So life and safety. First, what you're looking for is what on the property could create a life and safety issue for you, someone coming on the property, or your residents. So it's everything from loose handrails, loose banisters, stairs that could be a tripping hazard, banisters or railings where a child could get their head through the railing and then not be able to get their head back out because unfortunately they panic, not really realizing how to get their head out between the 2 round slats that they just put their head through, and then they panic and they can create potentially even death. So that will be called out as life and safety issues. I had a property manager on a campus property solve this so beautifully. So I sold a 17-unit apartment complex to a group of 5 women, and that property was 2-story, and up on the 2nd level it had an old handrail that was secure. It was made out of wrought iron, but the spacing between each of the slats no longer met code, and we weren't really sure how we were going to solve that, but the property manager had a brilliant idea. She had her maintenance crew install black chain link fence that was powder coated to that, so it prevented a child from having a safety or a life safety issue, as well as any residents or small pets or anything like that. So if you're buying a property and the inspector calls out the slats within the width of a fence because it no longer meets code, you may want to consider installing chain link fence because it's relatively cheap compared to rebuilding the entire banister or rebuilding the entire railing system, etc. So life safety are number 1. And even if a seller says the property is as is, I'm not going to do any repairs, I often encourage my sellers to cure life safety issues, because if it's brought to our attention in the meantime of the sale or during the sale process, if someone is injured, my seller would be liable. And so I really encourage my sellers to cure that stuff and not let it just lag and not worry about just passing that on to the buyer. But again, if a seller says it's as is, as long as that's disclosed to a buyer, the seller does not have to cure it. But life safety are one thing in particular. So I'm going to talk about the electrical next. And part of the electrical is important because, well, all of the electrical is important, but looking at the electrical panels, especially in multifamily properties, is super critical. Right now, insurance underwriters are looking for reasons not to put insurance binders on property, and electrical panels are one of the issues. If the electrical panels are outdated, and you can Google, there's 2 or 3 different companies, Zinsco, Federal Panels, there's a couple of panels that are on the federally recalled list. You should change those out because a buyer will require that before they are able to put an insurance binder on the property and before they're able to close the sale. So I recommend that you do that now. Okay, so electrical also has to deal with GFIs in multifamily that's within water inside of a unit. So that's near a kitchen sink or near a bathroom sink. Properties have to have GFIs in them to prevent residents from electrocuting themselves by having an electrical appliance near a water source. And if they drop a blow dryer in the sink or something like that, it could electrocute them. So GFIs are important. And a GFI typically runs about $250 to $300 for a licensed electrician to change that out. But if you're looking to buy, you should definitely look to see if there's GFIs in the property, and an inspector will catch that for you also and put that in your report. Okay, so plumbing is the next item that most inspectors will point out. And plumbing is important because if the pipe starts to rot out, then what happens is you may just have a break, and especially if your tenant is not home, then it could flood that unit, and if it's an upper unit, it could then pour into the unit down below. And we also recently have had some situations where tree roots have grown in between old pipes and cracked pipes, especially sewer pipes that lead from the property to the edge of the property where it connects with the city. And on the older properties, especially if they were built on a slab, typically they put the plumbing in first, then they poured the slab, and then they built above that. So if you've got faulty plumbing, then often that means you're gonna have to jackhammer inside a tenant's property or inside their unit. That means rolling back the carpet and literally jackhammering the floor to reach the leak or the pipe that's gone bad. So if you're buying, I recommend that you check the pipes and have what we call a sewer scope, where they actually run a camera down from the sewer clean out at the edge of the property all the way to where it connects with city services to make sure the pipes are in good working condition. And then a building inspector or a commercial property inspector, when they're going through, they will often take a flashlight and look under each sink, both the bathroom sink and the kitchen sink, because they're looking for leaks or signs that there were previous water leaks. Often we'll see a resident or a tenant who will have a bowl under a sink. That tells us that the pipe is leaking and the resident just didn't want to say anything to the property manager or to the owner. Often residents are afraid that they'll get booted or their rent will go up, which is not true. An owner cannot raise rent on a tenant for a leaking pipe. That's the owner's responsibility to cure that for the tenant. But often a tenant is just nervous, and so they'd rather say nothing and just put a bowl under there to catch the water rather than try to rock the boat. So I recommend that you do an annual inspection on your property, either with your property manager or by yourself, and check stuff like that, because again, residents typically won't tell you until it's too late. You should also check the caulk around the tub, the caulking, both at the edge of the floor where the tub and the floor meet, as well as around the edge of the tub, because if that caulk starts to wear out and you get water penetration back there, and again, your residents, they just want to have a safe place to live. So a lot of times they don't realize that they should bring that to your attention or put in a maintenance request. So it's your job as a property owner to be looking at those items. And when you're buying the property, you definitely want to look at that, because you're looking for dry rot and you're looking for any potential issues where you could have water running behind the bathtub, creating mold back there. Shower valves sometimes leak, so a good home inspector or a commercial property inspector will typically catch things like that when they're looking at the plumbing. Okay, next up is the roof. You want the roof inspected because most lenders are going to require that there's 3 to 5 years left on the roof at a minimum. You want to know that because if you're buying the property, you want to make sure and negotiate a new roof. Roofs on commercial properties and apartment complexes in particular, they are not a cheap date. Most of them are between $20,000, $30,000, $40,000, and now is the time that you could negotiate that with the seller, what I typically see is a buyer and seller will typically split it. The seller will pay half, the buyer will pay half, and the idea is the roof is at the end of the life, so the seller should pay for some of that, but not all of it, because the new buyer is going to get to enjoy the new roof, so the buyer agrees to split it. I very rarely see a seller pay for 100% of the roof, and I very rarely see a buyer pay for the full amount of roof. Normally it's just split 50-50. And the other thing about the roof is while the commercial building inspector is looking at the roof, they're also going to pop their head up into the attic and look on the backside of the roof. That's called the undersheath. And what they're looking for there is they're looking for mildew or mold patterns on the undersheath, because that's typically plywood. So on the trusses for the roof, they'll put plywood, and then they'll put the roof on top of that. So when a good inspector pops his head up into the attic, he can see if there's any mold or mildew. That will typically indicate that there's been leaking in the past or water issues. And so looking in the attic is also important. And most inspectors will not walk on the insulation or the trusses because they don't want to damage the impact of the insulation. Like, they don't want to step on it. Plus they could fall through the ceiling, but they don't want to crush the insulation that's in the attic. But they are definitely putting their head up there with a very strong, powerful light, and they're looking for discoloration on the sheathing to see if there's any issues there. And then the fifth and final thing is the foundation. This is important because if there's cracks in the foundation, that may indicate that there's some settling. In Eugene, Oregon, we've got soft settling clay in certain pockets of our city. And so having your foundation checked is an important factor. I know some property owners also factor in if they need earthquake strapping and things like that. That is definitely required in Portland, Oregon for earthquake strapping. Not so much in Eugene, that's more Multnomah County and Portland. But I know some homeowners in particular who live on side steep hills in Eugene do earthquake strapping in their basements because they want to make sure that they've got a solid foundation. So having your foundation checked with a commercial inspector is important, because also if there's standing water under the building, you may need a sump pump, and you wouldn't know that until the inspector got in there and started taking a look at it. So I hope you found this helpful. There's your 5 mistakes or things to pay attention to when you're looking for commercial property in 2025. Click on the bell down below to subscribe and get ready for our next video.